Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Togainu no Chi. So last time, Akira had a little hissy fit at Keisuke and made him run away. And now we're following the Christian fighter and seeing what he's up to. So let's get right into it, guys. This is all because he tried to steal those tags from the man who'd brought him. What? In one corner of the club called Meal of Duty, which served as a neutral zone of Igra fighters, there was an area where men with particular tastes gathered. Homosexual tastes? For one night alone, they would forget their respective positions and indulge in needs that could not be satisfied by normal means. It sounds like it. They had begun showing up there naturally without anyone prompting. Well, you know how it is. If you let them congregate, they will. They don't need an invitation. By unwritten agreement, the color of the cocktails each man held indicated his preferences. When men found kindred spirits, they would down each other's drinks to seal the bargain. The most dangerous color was blue. Uh-oh, double fisting? It indicated an interest in mutilation. Who comes into a bar in Igra and says, yeah, I'm interested in mutilation? What? And also, if you get a blue drink, does that mean that you want to be mutilated or you want to mutilate? How can you trust that the person drinking your drink wants to do the thing that you want them to do to you or be done by you? Included the severing of limbs. Such people rarely found partners and couldn't afford to be picky. Takeru had taken advantage of this. He'd approached a man holding a blue cocktail. His hair had been neat and swept back, his suit rumpled but high quality. The turned down corners of his eyes had given him a gentle look. One might have been forgiven for wondering what such a nice man was doing in Toshima, but that didn't account for the dark light lurking in the depths of his eyes. Delighted at having found a target for his sadism, he readily finished off Takeru's cocktail and took him straight to a cheap motel that stank of mold and dust. Oh boy, I can't wait to get sawed. Like the movie. This is gonna be fun. Of course, in Toshima, hotel was just another word for brothel. The sheets were damp and covered in old blood stains, and thin walls that did nothing to keep out the neighbors' moans. Why are the sheets covered in so much blood? Why are the brothels so bloody? When the man, losing his head with arousal, had pushed Takeru onto the bed and attempted to take off his clothes and take off his arms, you mean? Takeru had used the toe of one steel-tipped boot to kick the man's bulging crotch as hard as he possibly could. The creak of springs, a strangled whimper. Even after the man curled up on the floor, Takeru had kept kicking. His toes sank deep, crushing soft flesh, and he felt hot liquid gush over his foot. Ew, did he just break his ballsack? As the man convulsed, groaning in agony, Takeru had moved to take his tags. He'd been well aware that he was violating the rules, but those rules were hardly enforced to begin with. As long as he remained under the executioner's radar, it would all work out in the end, he'd thought. Besides, a little risk was nothing if it meant getting closer to Il Rey. He had no more time to waste. When the moans had ceased and the man had stopped moving, he'd rolled the man onto his back with his boot and reached for his tags. Just then a loud noise had rocked the flimsy building. Tucker's heart leapt into his throat. Jeers and footsteps, shouts and panicked voices. The sounds were getting closer. The pounding of his pulse grew until it felt like his whole body had become one giant heart. Sweat gushed from his pores. His lone eye frantically sought an escape. The door fell in with a bang, and beyond stood two tall men, the executioners. Without wasting a beat, Takeru shattered the window and leapt into the night. What? Is he Batman? He hissed one more time, punching the wall. Numbness spread through the back of his hand. The executioners had their eye on him now. No matter what he did, they would hound him forever. Takeru was their ideal prey. Like a pair of blood-mad hunting dogs, those two loved nothing so much as a chase. By running, he was giving them exactly what they wanted. It felt like he was already caught, like a hooked fish running at the end of his line. When his strength gave out, they would reel him in. That feeling only made him more desperate to escape. This was no time to curl up on the street. He had to get back on his feet, keep running. He looked up, sensing someone nearby. It wasn't the executioners. He could no longer hear their heavy footsteps. He scanned the moonlight alley. To his right, it looked like a dead end. To his left, a human shape was standing there, hazy in the dim light. A ghost? Nonsense. He didn't believe in such things. The figure appeared to be drawing closer, slowly and without making a sound. Watching the stranger carefully, he put a hand on his knife and prepared himself for battle. It hardly seemed necessary, however. The shape didn't look like it was here to fight. In fact, it appeared as defenseless as a child. Its gait was unsteady, as if its hands were in the clouds. I really like how you called it a ghost earlier. Like, well, that was just so weird. Was exhaustion making Takeru hallucinate? What? Or was it a ghost? See, why do you think it's a ghost? What's wrong with you? He couldn't trust his own eyes. The shape grew larger until it resolved into the outline of a man. There it stopped, still some distance away. The man's pale face was faintly visible. Though the darkness kept the details hidden, his lifeless eyes gave him an otherworldly air. Takuro growled in a tone thick with warning. His eyes never leaving the man, he felt that if he didn't speak, he might start to doubt his own existence. The man gazed back at Takuro in silence. This proved too much for Kakuru's frayed nerves. Takuro shouted, hoping to provoke a reaction, but his voice vanished into the night. Sweat ran down his face, cold and clammy. At last the man spoke, his voice soft as a breeze. It wasn't that soft to me, I don't think so. Was he calm? Empty? It was impossible to tell. For some reason, Takuro's heart skipped a beat. It was not soft at all. Like, it's cold. That has a cold, monotone voice. The man spoke as if he'd read Takuro's mind. A cold tendril of fear crawled up his spine. Takuro clenched his jaw and fixed the man with a powerful glare. Was the man smiling? The man took a single step towards him, and another. The same unsteady gait as before. The words fell from Takuro's lips. They sounded like a plea. The man drew closer. A shapeless terror seized him, smothering his will to fight. What? But his back was pressed to the wall, and the dead end to his right prevented him from escaping. Uh-oh, is he about to get big-hard? He squeezed his eyes shut. Fear gripped his throat like a vice. Something soft and cold touched his petrified cheek. He forced his eyes open just a crack. The man was gently cupping Takuro's cheek in one hand, and cupping his balls in the other. Naturally. A small smile played about his mouth. He regarded Takuro with pale blue eyes. His deep, rich voice seemed to fill Takuro's skull. He caressed Takuro's face. Though his hand was chilly, Takuro thought he sensed warmth. His fear dissipated, and for some reason a sense of utter peace welled up to replace it. Ugh, that was this music. It felt like a soothing embrace of sleep. The tension drained from his body and he sank against the wall. Desperate to avoid being swept into oblivion, he struggled to hold the man's gaze. The man's eyes were strikingly clear and narrowed in a smile. Takuro felt his mind melting away. It was like being under a spell he couldn't resist. You know what? Are the voices kind of low? You know, this is because last time, Rin's voice was just... Oops, that's the wrong thing. Rin's voice was just crazy loud for no reason. so I had to keep adjusting the voice. And now in this episode, it was still low. Ugh.
俺そうお前だ
Oh, so that was why you understood everything. I don't get it. Strangely, this felt right to Takeru. The man's words carried an irresistible power. They were close enough for their lips to brush. The man exhaled as he murmured.
もう楽になりたいだろ
Kind, knowing eyes studied him. Peace? What did that mean? With fading thoughts, Takeru reached for the answer.
死ぬのはごめんだ
The man's long eyelashes moved slowly, blinking as if to ward off Takeru's fears.
死ななくてもいいただもう少しだけ力がある楽になれる
The spell words sank deep into his brain. Yes, straight. That's what he needed. God, he's still going. I just kept on moving on. With enough strength to fight off the executioners, he would soon reach Il Rey and claim Vischio. After that, running the drug empire would be child's play. Is that child's play? If only he were stronger.
力が欲しい
Power.
欲しい
His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. His mind was frozen. He couldn't think. The man reflected in his eyes was everything.
すべてを凌駕する力すべてを凌駕する
The hand stroking Tucker's cheek gradually slid down to his throat. It was like being touched by soft ice. The hand crawled lower across the chest of Takeru's motorcycle jacket, then traced its way down his arm until it met Takeru's hand. Long fingers slowly closed around Takeru's.
お前を見下す者見返してやればいい
The final spell. Smiling, the man released his hand and stepped back. Takeru followed him with unfocused eyes. The man's silhouette grew blurry in the darkness. At last he vanished as if melting away. Or he just walking away, which is what you just said he did, but whatever. In the silence, all that remained was the afterimage of his smile. Time itself had come to a halt. I don't think it did. After what seemed like 1,000 years, Takeru returned to himself with a gasp. Sweat broke out all over his body. What had just happened? It felt like a dream. Feeling something hard in his left fist. Uh-oh. Takeru spread his fingers and looked down. A glass ample was resting on his palm. Oh, the first hit's always free. Rain. His sweat doubled. Where had it come from? When? Who placed it? The answer was as plain as day. The man had placed it there a moment ago, when he held Takeru's hand. It hadn't been a dream. Head throbbing, Takeru pressed a hand to his temple and squatted in place. Rain. He had never considered using it before. It was the one thing he wouldn't do, no matter how desperate he became. Takeru's mother had succumbed to the temptations of drugs, seeking an escape from their life of poverty. He knew all too well where that path led. He covered his face with a hand and took deep breaths, trying to get himself under control.
腐ってやる
He pulled the now chainless cross from his jacket's inner pocket and pressed it to his lips. Though they hadn't been related, Takeru's foster parents had treated him with warmth and affection. After him, they had welcomed a second child. The girl would become his little sister. Even poor, their life had been happy. In the CFC, however, it was impossible to receive any support without money. Much like the proverb about there being one set of laws for the rich and another for the poor, the wealthy continued to grow fat and strong while the destitute were left to starve in the cold. It was all about money, money, money. From the CFC's perspective, the poor were something to be ashamed of. The sooner they died out, the better. Eventually, growing pressure from the government had destroyed what peace Takeru's family had found. His mother had turned to drugs, while his father fell into depression, reduced to a lifeless creature who slaved all day for crusts of bread. There was no more talking around the dining room table. Takeru had briefly joined the blaster circuit, hoping to win enough money to support his family. But as his mother's addiction grew worse, she became a danger to herself. He was forced to abandon that dream. The police officer who responded to reports of a deranged female had laughed as they watched his mother cut into her own flesh. They had the eyes of spectators at a freak show. He'd lashed out at them. "It's your job to help her," he said, but the officers had gone on laughing. And so Takeru had joined Igura. He would defeat Ilrate, take over Vischio, and make all of them pay for what they'd done to his family. He'd made it this far on his own. It was just a little farther. All he needed was a little more strength. Takeru closed his fist around the ample. Rain might make his wish come true, hell yeah. But if he went down that path... When he opened his fist again and looked at the ample, the number on the label leapt out at him. 50%. The concentration of the drug within, weak. Most of rain on the market was 10%. Anything higher was almost impossible to obtain. Higher concentrations were more effective, but also carried a greater risk of rejection. Limitless power. His hand around the ample grew clammy with sweat. The man's words echoed in the back of his head. Make them pay for scorning you. Who had scorned him? A face immediately leapt to mind. The face of a man who'd never known defeat. The Blaster Champion took home some significant prize money. He would not need to fear starvation or the government's boot on his neck. He and Takeru were matched in strength. The sole difference between them was the burdens they carried. Don't be putting this on Akira. Heat bloomed at the base of Takeru's skull. It made his blood boil to think that such a man with nothing and no one to fight for, stood on the same field as him. His impotent rage had at last found a target. The man who'd made him feel lower than dirt. This time he would be the one to taste how it felt to be dragged through the mud. Takeru would wipe that cool look off his face. He would see the man he hated break down in despair. Perhaps the man would even beg for his life. Goosebumps rose on his back. His lips curved into a smile. Like Kira is really living rent-free in your mind. He took the ample up in his fingers. The man who'd left it, who had felt as insubstantial as a ghost, who in the world was he? Takeru no longer cared to know the answer. Well, you don't care anymore now that you got the drugs. If his body failed to accept the drug, it would kill him. But now that the executioners marked him as their prey, they would pursue him until they had their taste. Either way, he was as good as dead. Squeezing his cross in one hand, he snapped off the ample's tip with the other. His heart was racing, his breathing ragged, sweat dripped from his chin. With a dropper, he could take it in small doses, but of course he didn't have one on him. The transparent liquid shook. Takeru's hand was trembling. His heart seemed ready to burst from his mouth. He closed his eyes firmly and took deep breaths. Then he put the tip of the ample to his lip and tilted it all the way back. The cross fell from his hand. Not Jesus! I love how it had to, like, go to black, fade in the dialogue. The cross fell from his hand, then the dialogue had to fade out. It's like... Not the cross! It's like he's not even the same person anymore. That cross was everything to him. Losing it symbolizes that he's lost himself. So stupid. God. The moon had been awfully lovely that night. Oh no. Takeru turned to look over his shoulder. It was past midnight. His little sister Yukari, who should have been fast asleep, was standing in the doorway. She trotted up to him and clung to his knees. The hem of her favorite pink nightdress trailed along the ground, dirty. He crouched down and dusted off her hem. Their mother had been taken to a rehab facility. At least that's what they called it. What do they really do there? In the truth, it was just a place to store undesirables. Nobody ever returned alive, but he couldn't tell Yukari that. He told her instead that their mother was in the hospital. And now the kind lady next door had agreed to look after Yukari. She had always been fond of his sister, and Yukari was too small to be much of a burden. Takeru would not have to worry about leaving her alone with their zombie-like father. There was nothing left to keep him from joining Igura except this. He had meant to leave for Toshima without catching his sister's notice, but now innocent eyes looked up at him, begging him to stay. Unable to bear it, he hugged her tight.
兄ちゃんとゆかりと母さんと父さん、また仲良く一緒に暮らせるように頑張ってくるから。
Are you telling me you got an ugly ass gay makeover before you went to Toshima? You were like, I can't go to Toshima looking like this. I'd be a laughing stock. I need to get that blue hair, do it all up with some mousse. What the hell? I don't know what to say. Thin, soft arms wound tightly around him, and she embraced him with all her strength. Her tiny warmth brought tears to his eyes.
お兄ちゃん、これあげる。
She pressed something into his hand.
お前、これ。
It was a simple silver rosary their mother had given her for her birthday. She wore it day and
あ
night.
げる。
大切なものだろ。ちゃんと持ってろよ。
いいの。お兄ちゃん持って行って。お母さんがきっと守ってくれるよ。
Well, if she's taking that much Rhine, maybe we should have taken her, you know? She could have been our muscle. Right? His chest clenched. He was certain his heart would burst. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he accepted the rosary and kissed off the top of her head.
ありがとう。またみんなでどこか遊びに行こうな。
Takeru hung the rosary around his neck, wiped his eyes, and stood up. He patted his little sister on the head tenderly, reluctant to let her go.
それじゃあ行ってくるから。兄ち
いってらっしゃい。
She kept waving to him as he drew further and further away, until he could no longer see her tiny form. He looked up. The moon was beautiful and almost bright enough to blind him. Its shine lit the way forward. Until, at last, the darkness swallowed it. The sun had risen before he knew it. His body was exhausted, but he remained wide awake. Akira laid his leaden head against the backrest of the uncomfortable sofa. The crumbling ceiling filled his sight. Motomi was smoking on the sofa across from him, deep wrinkles carved into his furrowed brow. Beside him sat Rin, slumped over with his head on the armrest. Like Akira, neither of them had slept. Keisuke was still missing. If you wanted to go ground in Toshima, ground what? It was easy enough to do so. If you wanted to go to ground in Toshima, I don't know what that means. The city was rife with tunnels and warrens and cubby holes, all of shapes and sizes. If you want to go underground, is what it meant to say. Keisuke must be hiding somewhere. At least, that was what Akira decided to think. The alternatives didn't bear contemplating. God,
ちょっ
Akira,
く
you're
ら用事があ
terrible.
るんで、俺はそろそろ行くが。
Breaking their long silence, Motomi stood ponderously. A pile of cigarette butts lay at his feet. Ran looked up at Motomi and saw him off with a tepid grunt. Everything seemed far away to Akira, a sure sign that his nerves were frayed. Something landed atop his head. It took a moment to realize it was Motomi's hand.
まあ、気を落とすなよ。俺も探してみる。何？伊達に情報や名乗ってるわけじゃないからな。
Motomi's tone was light, but Akira could only manage the barest of nods in reply. After looking at him for a few more seconds, Motomi flashed a parting smile and left through the broken doors. Now Akira was alone with Rin and the two sitting on opposite sofas. The lobby was in constant motion, an ever-shifting stream of people walking past on their way in and out. Only in the space around Akira and Rin did the air remain still as it had since the last evening. Suddenly, Rin sprang and stretched both arms high above his head, then clapped the sides of his face with his hands.
心配だけどさ、でもきっと大丈夫だよ。危ない危ないっつってもなんだかんだ言って結構やってけるもんだからさ。 おっさんも俺も探すし、そんなに遠くには行ってないと思うし。
His voice deliberately bright, Rin plopped himself down next to Akira. The broken springs creaked beneath the added weight.
ねえねえ、写真でも見よっか。俺いつも持ち歩いてんの。結構いい感じの写真とかあるんだよ。見て見て。
No, he's gonna like accidentally go over one of his nudes. He's gonna be like, "Oops." Delete it from your memory unless... No, I couldn't. Unless... Rin rummaged around his waist pouch, then produced a bundle of photos. Akira let his gaze drift towards them.
これは処刑人の盗み取りでしょ。んでこれがね、ああそうそう、タグ取りだ。
I don't like how they look right now. I don't like how Rin looks like he's coming on to Akira.
これがね、あ、これ懐かしいな。ブラスターで撮ったやつだ。
His face brightening, Rin held out one of the photographs so Akira could see it as well. It showed a man, face covered with bruises, making a frantic effort to grab something.
こいつがさ、もうすんげえ勢いで相手に飛びかかってくのよ。ボコボコにされてて血まみれなんだけどさ、結局負けちゃったけど、でもちょっと感動したかな。俺ああいうやつ大好き。ゾクゾクしちゃう。
ブラスターに参加してたのか。
うん、してたよ。言ったじゃん、こう見えても結構強いんだって。アキラは？
ああ、
おお、そうだったんだ。個人戦？チーム戦？どっち？
個人戦のみ。
ほうほう。俺逆にチーム戦オンリーだったからな。
Akira's thoughts have been distracted, but this piqued his interest. Rin's eyes are sparkling too.
どこのエリアにいた？
レイダー。
ああ、あの辺か。なんか強いの集まってた気がしたな。競合の地とかよく言ってたもん、仲間内で。
Rin cast his eyes upward and nodded several times as if recalling fond memories, but then his expression changed to a rueful smile.
俺さ、ブラスター抜けたの結構前なんだけどさ、今みたいなシステム化するのより前の方が好きだったな。
あ、
Akira could sympathize with that.
でしょ？だよね、やっぱそうだよね。なんつか昔の方がさ、こうみんな元気よかったっつうか。
Rin was talking about the time before Blaster was Blaster, before it was divided into areas and ranks, teams and individuals. Akira hadn't been a fighter back then, but he'd gone to see the matches every chance he got. It had been an undeniably crude affair where men got together for no other reason than to punch each other out in alleyways. But there was also no denying it had felt more real. God, you guys just have problems. Just about all the fighters from the early days said that there were things better back then. It had been a pure contest of strength. Win or lose, everyone was respected.
渋さみたいなのあったじゃない。それに憧れて最初は参加したんだよね。なんか喧嘩して本当の仲間を見つけるっていうのかな。そういうやつボッコボコになって腹の底から睨み合って、そんで仲良くできたらさ、もう最高じゃん。一番嫌な部分見せてんだもん。それ以上壊れようがないよね。
そうだな。
けどなんか変なルールを誰かが勝手に決め出しておかしくなってったよね。やたら勝ち負けにこだわって誰が上だ下だってさ。最初は面白いと思ったけどすぐに飽きちゃった。中身がないんだもん。なんで人間って何でも規則を作りたがるんだろうね。
Grimacing, run, folded his hands behind his head and leaned into the backrest.
それが理由か。
ん？なんの？
リンがイグラに参加した理由。
ああ。
For an instant, the expression vanished from Rin's face. Akira told himself that it meant nothing, that this was just how Rin looked when he was lost in thought. But the void there was cold enough to make him shudder.
まあそんなとこかな。俺はチームで参加してたんだけど、解散してみんないなくなっちゃったしね。
Rin's expression soon returned, and he gave Akira a lonely smile. Perhaps this was a difficult subject for him.
そういうアキラはなんで？やっぱ同じ理由？
Akira fumbled for an answer. He couldn't tell the truth after all.
そんなところだ。
そっか。それにしてもアキラもブラスターに参加してたなんてね。なんか嬉しいな。ん？
Rin, who had been stretching his arms and legs out wide, suddenly leaned towards the floor.
あらら、大切なものが落ちてるよ。これ、アキラの。
Rin held up a bundle of tags. When Akira checked his jacket pocket, he couldn't feel any tags inside. They must have slipped out without his noticing. Not a surprise, even by how distracted he'd been all night.
悪い。
いえいえ、どういたしまして。でも気をつけないとダメだよ。俺じゃなかったら取られてたぞ。
He took his tags back from Rin. 4 of his own plus the 5 he'd swiped made 9 for 9 total. This was the first time he had any chance to examine all the new tags in one place. With good lighting, they were 2, 3, 5, 7, and 9, all pig tags. They were black with blood, not Akira's. The silver-haired man hadn't bled either, at least not during their fight. This blood had likely belonged to some previous owner.
アキラ、寝なくて平気？顔がどんよりしてきてるけど。
Akira pulled back as Rin peered at his face. Rin had a point. His thoughts felt like molasses, and his eyes were developing the grainy texture of fatigue. What? Perhaps talking about Blaster had relaxed Akira enough for his exhaustion to catch up with him.
ちょっと寝ておく？疲れてるっしょ。俺ついててあげてもいいよ。
いや、でもケイスケを探さないと。
そんなフラフラの状態で？
Well, I think I'll probably take Rin's offer, but we will continue this next time in the next episode of Togainu no Chi. So I thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. So, bye guys.